What's going on, folks? Ted from Immersion here, and we have 3 new articles from 3 new news sites, all about different realms within Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. So, as we saw with the video I made previously, where Lisa Penrose had posted having received some of the books, it looks like a variety of news outlets have also gotten a chance to interview folks from D&D, or have gotten early access to some of this stuff and were able to write articles. Each wrote an article, at least the 3 that I have, on a different domain. So we have an article from Sci-Fi, an article from Forbes, and an article from Polygon. Now, I don't know if I'll be getting the copies early. Again, I mentioned this in the last video. If so, be on the lookout for an impromptu live stream where I'll answer all of your questions about whatever's in said book. But let's go ahead and go through these, and we basically have 3 different domains to talk about, like I said. We have Lamordia, which is basically the Frankenstein version here. So if we were to go through and click through and read this, and I read this one already. So it said it was originally, in the 1990s Ravenloft Realm of Terror box set. And it said it is essentially, it takes inspiration from Frankenstein, right? It says it right here. But it says, how do you make body horror work in an imagination-based game? And in my opinion, what I've been saying with a lot of these kind of horror concepts, how do you make horror exist in a game where you are a hero with magic powers and hit points and things like that? So it says, when you hear mad scientists making living corpses, you obviously think of Frankenstein. Is that the inspiration? And it said a lot of them are based, and a lot of the different domains have their roots in what is traditional horror, right? Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, the Mummy, and so on, right? That's how it originally started, right? When you can make quick correlations, like Dracula is Strahd, Lamordia here is kind of like a Frankenstein situation. So it says, while it's inspired, we've taken a bunch, taken to different, it says dozens of horrific extremes, okay? Morden's Lamb isn't just about resurrection gone awry, it's also a domain of all different types of science gone wrong, bizarre experiments, body weirdness, and so on. Just as there's more to Frankenstein than a scientist who abandoned his child, there's more to Lamordia than stitches and semi-dead flesh. It says, is Victra Mordenheim your classic mad scientist, or did you D&D-ize her? And then they basically go on to describe how they are precise. They don't actually answer that question. Says the only, was looking for non-magical immortality, right? We know you can obtain immortality through magic. This is sort of immortality through science. And it says she has a device bound within the body of her former companion. This is what here was a question I wanted to get to. How do you make body horror work in D&D? How do you make players feel horrified about what's happening to their characters' imaginary bodies? And it says one of the terrifying possibilities is when you wake up on her slab, right? You are bound, you are there, being experimented on. We explore a few ways characters might find their bodies held hostage, while Mordheim tasks them to fulfill her heartless whims. And they go on to say the reborn lineage could play into this if you decide to go that way. What, if anything, does Lamordia offer DMs and parties who are running in a homebrew campaign? A very good question, because if you don't plan on playing on Ravenloft, is this book for you? And it says, in a sort of micro setting unto itself, Lamordia might slip into any setting, just as domains of Ravenloft can be from any other world. Beyond that, Mordenheim as a character, her bizarre creations, and all the details of running adventures rooted in body horror and bizarre science could readily make an appearance in any setting when players least expect it. And it says, what are you most excited about? And it says, Amanda Hammond worked with me on writing this, many of which go beyond Frankenstein. I'm jazzed to hear what readers do with everything beyond Mordenheim's lab. Like terrible radiations, what lurks in the glacial seas, and the mysteries of the mountains, infamously called the Sleeping Beast. Then we jump over to the Forbes article, and we're talking about, I think it's Dementlieu? I don't know, it's French. But yeah, this is sort of a psychological horror one, and this is the Grand Masquerade one. You might have seen images of that going around. It says, everyone is dying to be invited to the Grand Masquerade, held by Duchess Sadra Donaire every week on her private island, and in many cases killed if they are discovered at the ball if they're not supposed to be there. The whole domain plays up the elements of deception, psychological manipulation, and creepy fairy tales, all in a setting where the land itself changes in a malicious and impossible ways. It's a domain that leaves everyone paranoid and posturing to blend into a crowd while being terrified that they'll be exposed for not being in on the collective lie. Oh, and there's murderous phantoms. Aside from the nostalgia of Ravenloft, horror and D&D are a natural fit. I don't agree with that, but it's fun to play a character dealing with terrifying situations. It's fun to play terrifying situations dealing with characters. Ravenloft provides endless opportunities to choose your role as a player or DM. Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft is a rare return for 5th edition to a setting that's already been touched. And that I do agree with, right? We already saw Curse of Strahd. We already had a book on it, and we're now going back to make another version of it. While genres like gothic horror, body horror, and folk horror have sizable footprints in the book, there are also discussions about disaster horror, slasher horror, and occult detective stories, amongst others. How do you set a zombie apocalypse in D&D or turn any monster into your own Michael Myers? These sections explore those concepts, and I'm excited to see how DMs run them. And then it's just, it'll be available on the 18th. And then lastly, we have the Polygon article, which is about the sort of mummy-themed one, right? The, what is it? Har'Akir, the Dark Lord Ankotep, which again sounds makes me think of Imhotep, the mummy. Okay, so we're rebooting Ravenloft. We talked a little bit about the history here over the years. We talked about the Vistani. Nonetheless, the adventure proved to be wildly popular. Strahd and Ravenloft. One of the domains is called Har'Akir, and it's a setting that in the past has leveraged problematic Orientalist tropes to tell its tales. One of the things we were really interested about this domain is the past versions of it. We see this a lot in RPGs. It's treated as part of history as an adventure setting. Definitely the older versions of Har'Akir were very, hey, you saw Boris Karloff's The Mummy. Here, run that as an adventure, which is what they kind of used as the image here, right? Boris Karloff's The Mummy, the old Universal monster, which is kind of what I alluded to at the beginning. We've seen that before, and we wanted to do something that felt different and something that feels uniquely D&D. And since it will spoil, I guess, spoiler warning, folks, it will spoil some of the secrets, so keep that in mind. And as well as Curse of Strahd. So it says, part of the solution was to return Har'Akir's malevolent Dark Lord it said Ankotep at the start. Ankotep is what it says, and then here it says Anktepot? I don't know which one it is. It's back. There's two different pronunciations here. Into something other than an English actor covered in hundreds of yards of fabric pretending to be an Egyptian. I think you'll even see from the image, which is this one here, which says, see here, it says Anktepot. That is not Boris Karloff, but down here it says Ankotep. So I'm very confused. It's much more a magical looking character who we are feels like a character, that it feels like a mummy that comes from a D&D setting, that comes from a high... Wait, what? Is a much more magical looking character who we are hoping feels like a character, that it feels like a mummy that comes from a D&D setting, that comes from a high fantasy setting, not necessarily from the history of Egypt. God, that sentence is just awful. Maybe I misread it, but I don't know. I read it twice, and I still don't think it reads correctly. But anyway, part of the creative process required bringing in outside writers. The writers at Wizards also worked to give the denizens more agency. This time they're not simply part of the setting. Whether it's the Boris Karloff version of the Mummy or the Brendan Fraser one, there's a story of outsiders coming in and having adventures in this other culture. This time around, we provide you all the elements needed to be somebody from Har'Akir, to have this world be your world. This isn't necessarily a story about going into tombs and grave robbing and pillaging someone else's past. This can very easily be a story about your home. Your character can imagine a world where there are not these horrors, and it's up to you to make them better. That's a quite different proposition from what you see in many of the classic horror stories, but also nonetheless terrifying, because now what's happening is within your own home. And Richten's guide also uses the idea of nightmare logic to further distance itself from a real Egypt and to make the realm of Har'Akir seem something entirely different. Why is there a domain that is a desert that is riddled with these ancient, inexplicable haunted monuments and ruined pyramids? How does a domain like that exist? How does it make sense? To an extent, it doesn't, and it's going to be the players that come out and explore that who are some of the only people that realize that the entirety of the domain is, to an extent, gaslighting them. Van Richten's Guide is a 256-page book, the same size as modern D&D supplements like Curse of Strahd. The more than 30 domains of Dread will, at most, just get just 5 or 6 pages dedicated to them. That means DMs will need to do a lot of creative work alongside their players to flesh out their campaigns. Said that the team also worked in another more elaborate storyline for ambitious DMs interested in taking this to the next level. Maybe Tatiana's soul is in Har'Akir and is actually Octopot's soul. Maybe Octopot's soul is in Barovia and is tied up with Tatiana. There's an interesting potential link there. Hey, do you want us to tell the story where maybe you've got two different Dark Lords vying for the same lost spirit? Just one of these fun little links that as you start putting the domains together, some really creepy narratives potentially come out of them. And that's available on the 18th of May. So that was interesting. Some of them were, I feel like we got more information about Lamordia. Like that was a very targeted, well-written article. I feel like the one about Dementlieu, or I don't know how to pronounce it. But anyway, that one was like, it was a little bit about it and then a lot of just generic stuff about about the book in general. And then again, this last one here from Polygon about Har'Akir was more targeted. We got a lot of information more about how they're changing the setting. But I really like that little bit where they said like maybe you could use this book in conjunction with Curse of Strahd, which is something that I never really put together in my head. I don't know why, right? They're both Ravenloft, so it kind of makes sense. But I always kind of considered like Curse of Strahd as a standalone adventure that exists in almost like in a silo, whereas this is a new book. But it'll be interesting because we have Curse of Strahd, but we're also going to get information about the Ravenloft, the Barovia domain in this book. So I'm curious if there's going to be improvements, extra information, how much you can use the Barovia info in this book to outfit your Curse of Strahd campaign. And again, like they talked about at the end, maybe combining domains to get you where you are now. So let me know what you think. Again, we're getting little dribs and drabs of news. This is kind of standard stuff as we get closer. We're 14 days away from the official launch of the book, when my coverage will, kick into full gear. But if things happen in between, I will gladly continue to do more coverage. Also, just as a general reminder, if you folks come across interesting news or things that you find specific about Ravenloft that Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft that I haven't covered or you haven't seen here on the channel, feel free to send it to me in some variety of social media. I would like to thank a lot of you out there for constantly sending me stuff, because you help me get the research, and then, as a reward, I go ahead and make this video and talk through it and give you my opinion. So if you find something and it's interesting, shoot it over to me as soon as you can, and then I'll try to make a video on it. Thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned for more stuff. And hey, if you liked the video, feel free to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'll see you all next time.